So now on to our next featured speaker, Neil Kacena. Neil was Vice President of Technology, Innovation, and Strategy at Raytheon, and he went on to form his own firm for the development of advanced system concepts and product improvements. Now, previously, he was the deputy head of the Skunk Works. And we're going to show a photo of the book cover here in a second. Great, okay. So he's the author of Stealth, an example of technology's role in the American way of war. And it's available online at the Air Force War College at Maxwell Air Force Base. And go to their website, and they have a whole library of publications and dissertations, and look for Neil's.
Yeah, this looks like a great read, Neil. And Nicole, Neil's another great associate we should be thinking about spotlighting.
Absolutely.
Just saying.
Yep, absolutely. Now, if anyone has questions for Neil, just type it in the chat. And now, okay, without further ado, over to you, Neil.
Oh, very good. I'll see where we can go here. First of all, I just want to say thanks to Sarah and her. One more time, she's introduced me to a world which I have little or no knowledge and hardly any intersection with, until you showed me that Rauschenberg's got this thing called Monogram, and I stared at that for a second. I go, maybe that's not too far off from where I've been. So very good. Thank you. Let's see where we go here. See if this thing will go to the, there we go. So I'm going to blame this all on AJ. He asked me if I would say something about my career today, so I will. And for those of you that remain awake for the rest of this, maybe you'll have some questions and we'll try and answer all those. I think you will see in these particular PowerPoint charts that I've broken all the known PowerPoint presentation rules and procedures and techniques. But that's primarily because those of you that drift off and determine that what I'm saying either is not useful or doesn't apply to you, maybe you'll find something entertaining in these charts that'll take you where you're going. So this is, in fact, I think maybe, yeah, we started in the middle. You won't be able to tell, so that's not going to be a problem where the middle and the end is. But what I want to do say up front is you will see these charts are far overpacked. The first 3 or 4 are full up career charts in and of themselves, but I thought we'd take a look at those, then we might go into some more detail, and then at the end we'll toy with one of my famous statements of everybody's always talking about lessons learned, and my experience has been there have been many lessons observed and far fewer actually learned. So there's something maybe to think about. I want to give you a little context in terms of, and these are self-reported, so you can choose to assign some level of credibility to any of these. But bottom line, I always wanted to be a pilot. In kindergarten, I was drawing pictures of airplanes, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot. So how I got there, I didn't have many people are challenged. What do I want to do when I grow up? I did not have that challenge. Ultimately, basically, I was educated as an engineer with a profound interest in math and science, so that made sense. As from a pilot perspective, I always wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I can't really explain that exactly. The engineer in me, and then there was this idea of change, which we'll talk about in a second, and that put me in the innovator's role and thought process. And then for some reason, I ended up liking challenge to connect the dots, so to speak, and try to define and determine elements of strategy associated with that. I took one and only one aptitude test in my lifetime, and that was actually just prior to retirement from the Air Force. The Air Force had an excellent transition program, and I took advantage of it. And I went in and consciously answered all the questions on the test or the survey or whatever they called it, the career finder process. And it came up that I had 2 equal, very strong interests at that time. Of course, I've been in the Air Force 25 years now. One was aircraft mechanic, and the other was a lawyer. which may explain some other things, but obviously I didn't ever do either of those. And then also primarily in the Air Force over a period of about 25 years, and many of you have probably taken the Myers-Briggs, and I've actually took it, I think, 6 times. And I started out as a firewalled ESTP and ended up as a further firewalled ESTP. I mean, I never change, always consistent kind of thought process. So you see a couple bullets here that describe an ESTP. And a lot of people I hung around with or was lucky to be engaged with were ESTJs. But so they always had to look at me and try and figure out where I was going, what I was doing. You can see this blue box in the center is kind of the ultimate realists, or another description, unconventional approach, fun kind of thing, and spontaneous. I would describe, others have highlighted ESTPs as keep your options open. So I'd open up with, for those of you that have to work for a living, you have to accomplish tasks in a certain amount of time and make decisions and get on with it. So that's one of those things that early on, I mean, if I didn't understand the ESTP yet or understand what that was all about, I ultimately, probably without thinking about it, crafted ways to think about how do I get things done and really think about that, because that was not part of my innate background. I've always been a fan of Theodore Roosevelt. And I think one of the key elements that Roosevelt said, and those of you, I don't have the entire quote on here, but for those of you that recognize it, you know, Teddy was dare greatly. And that quote, you know, the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, ... So big values there. While I am not a Kennedy fan, precisely, other than I certainly admire his PT-109 experience, you will note that I think one of the focus areas that he had there, and he's an ESTP along with Teddy, is change. And we're going, and I'll just highlight this idea of change right now, because it really came to roost when I was in effect the COO at the Skunk Works, and understanding what change and the impact it had on individual people. And you find that some people deal with change well, classically ESTPs, and others don't. ESTJ might be an example of that. And I'm not casting dispersions, but the Skunk Works was an organization that was built, sustained, and actually succeeded based on how it handled change, in essence. And there were people that came in and really wanted to be there, and ultimately SIE, you know, self-eliminated themselves, ultimately wanted to go back to the core LM Aero business because they were not comfortable in that environment of change and uncertainty across the board. So, all right, so you got a little background, maybe probably more than you ever wanted to know. If you wanted a narrative summary of kind of where I've been, there's basically really focused on fighter jet across the board. So operations, training, sustaining, improvement, derivatives, and, you know, a significant amount of acquisition experience. So fundamentally in my career, in my Air Force career, about a third of it was in the acquisition side. But the formative years were all in the operational and tactics side in the fighter business. Many of the innovation pieces I learned in Air Force acquisition then brought me into the Skunk Works, and then further on to Raytheon. And I would argue that the job title that kind of would come out of that last chart I showed you is probably the job title that I had at Raytheon, you know, the VP of Technology, Innovation, and Strategic Pursuits. So I think that basically checked all the squares. And then ended up, after I failed retirement the first 2 times from the Air Force and Lockheed, and then went to Raytheon, and then I succeeded, so to speak, and I, you know, started the own LLC and went from there. Air Force was particularly 2 tours in the Pentagon at something called SAF, AQL, Secretary of the Air Force, AQL, which was the Air Force's classified portfolio and was really, I would argue, the core innovation engine in the Air Force. And you won't see the specifics of that until 10 or 20 years or even longer down the line. Some of the programs that I was running or administering or involved with in my first tour in the Pentagon, which started in '87, are still classified today. And I would argue that's because they were so well thought out, so well executed, and their value to the customer is so good even as we speak, today. I already tagged you with the idea of, lessons observed versus lessons learned, and to think about, as you use that term lessons learned, how do you actually incorporate a lesson learned and make it into a lesson observed and capture what you learn from that. All right, so this is the easiest slide that you'll see, and I tried to look back, and I call this a career template. And before you saw my charts that this is all in hindsight, I don't want to give anybody the impression that I had a clue where I was going, and how I was going to get there. But if I tried to capture the main elements of it, you would see this kind of a pyramid or triangle. And I'd start in the bottom. I guess I would say one of my first Air Force mentors, who was a lieutenant colonel at the time, who ended up retiring as a 3-star. I was a lieutenant, and he gave me the 3 main points. He said, integrity, loyalty, and make the hard cuts. And eventually, at some point, I wrote 3 or 4 or 5-page paper on that expanded that idea. But integrity clearly includes honesty as one of its major elements. And integrity is primarily individual, although it ultimately attaches to an organization. So that's all about you and how you do what you think is right, engage in a way that you think and are not ultimately leaned on or corrupted or otherwise coerced by an organization or other element to go someplace you don't want to go. Loyalty is a term that was more in vogue when he told me this, and it's not talked about a lot today, but I think it's still a critical issue. And I would argue that loyalty, some people just say, loyalty means do what you're told by somebody who is your commander in your chain of command or XYZ. And I would argue that's not at all what loyalty is about. Loyalty is about just the opposite of that, being willing to tell that person why this is not a great idea. I don't really want to do this, and really have the fortitude at some point to say from a military perspective, ultimately that's not a lawful order. I'm not doing it. Could be the far end of that spectrum. And then make the hard cuts is the point I made earlier, and I had to really probably work on that, or it really is tough to do. You got to go ahead and make those cuts, make those decisions. And you'll hear about John Boyd in a little bit in terms of thinking about that. You see change on the left-hand side and trust. And I would say those 2 things are absolutely required, flowed through teamwork to create innovation. So as you look at this thing, just another way to think about where you're going. And again, some thoughts that I had in hindsight with this ultimate goal, I think I already mentioned, is connecting the dots. If I looked at a visualization, and I've been a strong proponent my whole life of visualization, or you can think about that as how you develop a value proposition. And that value proposition, in my mind, has got to be 3 things. It's got to be relevant, it's got to be credible, and it's got to be compelling. And it generally includes visualization elements, and whether those are charts or pictures or some way that the audience or the customer or who you're just having that discussion with can really get into it and understand it and come back to those 3 elements and say, yes, they're there. I'll point out a couple of things here. One in the upper left-hand corner, it's the Caterpillar Club. So that was a Caterpillar Club, for those that don't know, is those who have ejected from a fighter or from an aircraft and survive, become a member of the Caterpillar Club. So that's one of the key elements there. In the Skunk Works you see on the left-hand side, I had the opportunity to receive go to the White House and receive the National Medal of Innovation, along with my boss, Frank Capuccio, and we'll talk about Capuch in a little bit, which was great. And then there's the Collier trophies, which is the time I was there were 6, and now there's many more at the Skunk Works since the time I've left. So another element or metric benchmark of success. I'm going to talk about a tour to Doha, Qatar. Those who've not had an opportunity to actually live in the Middle East for 2 years, I got to do that. I got to build a secret air base there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And you can see some of these other elements here. So if we take the next 2 charts, and this is basically a distillation of an Air Force career and the fundamentals leading up to that across the board. And the next one will be more of the industry side of it. I was kind of an athlete, like I said, just because I was, 3 sports in high school, 2 in college. And you can add water skiing, snow skiing, and scuba diving to that if you want, across the board. At Iowa State, lots of interesting experiences in the College of Engineering. I happened to be in a fraternity there, another exercise in close living and understanding how you need to deal with people close at hand, accommodate them, yet do what you need to do. I was not only was I there on a baseball scholarship, I was an Air Force ROTC. That's where I earned my pilot's license across the board. My first assignment after graduating was to Columbus, Mississippi. So those of you that have been to the Iron Triangle may recognize this. I was single at the time, so Magnolia was the dorm for the Mississippi State College for Women, which I, of course, never went to. But my first experience of getting to Columbus, somebody determined that I needed a haircut, where I thought I had really cut my hair as short as it could possibly go on my entry to the full up real Air Force. And I thought I was in good shape, but the barber decided that I really wasn't there yet. He asked me where I was from. I said, I was from Iowa. And he said, Mississippi grows more corn than Iowa. So that's my first day on the base. And I'm not a farm kid, but I was pretty darn sure growing up in Iowa that was not true. And I don't think that's true today, but it was by the way he was talking and explained it. I don't know that it was either relevant. It probably wasn't credible, and it certainly wasn't a compelling argument. But nevertheless, I decided it wasn't time or place and didn't need to do that. Another interesting fact is I had arthroscopic surgery on my left knee in college after I blew out a knee. And so the Air Force at the time said, oh yeah, go ahead and get it, no problem. And when I got to pilot training, I sat in the study room for about 2 months longer while everybody else started flying. Said that we don't know about your knee yet. We don't know. And I'd done all the things. I'd done the parachute training and everything. And finally, you find out that, I was talking to my dad about that. Well, the short story is he was a B-20, flew B-24s out of Italy in World War II. He went to Palesti 8 times. And his commander, his pilot in that aircraft was now a bank administrator in San Antonio, where the Air Force Training Command was. So Dad called his buddy. His buddy got on his World War II dress uniform, went into the Air Force headquarters and asked them very politely why I was not being allowed to start flying. And the next day I had my first sortie. So how these things work out is just sometimes amazing. Went on, I got an F4 out of pilot training, which was the coup de grace. Couldn't have been anything better. That's exactly where my focus was. But one of my first experiences at Luke in RTU was meeting John Boyd. Those of you that don't know John Boyd, I'll recommend a book, not by him, but by a Dutch fighter pilot that studied John. And John, I would say, is the premier U.S. strategist in the last half of the 1950 to 2000. And if you have any interest, I would recommend reading that book. I'll note that while I have read On War by Clausewitz, and even though I can get by in German, I read it in English. I'm not recommending that anybody read that, actually. But John Boyd's, this book is a little bit like that. You will find John Boyd tough plowing, but it may be quite valuable for you. And spent a lot of time on nukes in the F4C at RTU. And naturally, as soon as we got to Southeast Asia, there wasn't anything to do with nukes. It was all about air to air and primarily air to ground. So another example of a lot of training, but maybe not exactly focused on what you're going to do. Barbarella was the name of a paved spike pod. And I got there, and somehow the timing was that I became the owner of one of the 8 pre-production paved spike. And those that you remember ZOT, paved ZOT, were the first pods that allowed laser guided bombs to hit the Fanwa Bridge after multiple attempts. And now they took it out in one sortie. And Barbarella was the second version of that. And so I got to be introduced to brand new technology at the time and actually operated with through multiple operations. If this doesn't start out a career to say, what am I doing here? Our three of the main operations were Phnom Penh, which is the capital of Cambodia, evacuation of Phnom Penh, evacuation of Saigon. If any of you have been flying over Saigon at 5,000 feet with 2,000-pound LGBs, a paved spike pod, an ELQ-119 jammer, another piece of hardware they threw on the airplane just before we left that was a counter for IR, and watch the helicopters coming off the US Embassy and actually be close enough to see the swarm of people trying to get there and get out. That is mentally damaging. Maiguez is actually the last combat operation of the Vietnam War, which is the island of the boat that was taken by the Khmer Rouge. And there's a whole story, I could spend a whole story on that, which taught me that they were trying to command us from the basement of the Pentagon. So the time delays that this is spring of 75 were amazing. And that fixed in your mind, one of the lessons from Vietnam War is you've got to delegate the command and control to the people that are in the arena and make it happen. Came home via Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, and American Samoa, and back through Hawaii that year, and ended up after Christmas, sometime between years, I had an assignment to the F4E, which at the time was a great assignment at Seymour Johnson because it was an air-to-air unit, and I had been all air-to-ground basically in Southeast Asia. I had the only telegram I've ever received in my life. I don't know how many of you have actually received a telegram. There's some that have a similar hair color out there to mine, and it said, do not report to Seymour Johnson, go to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And talk about a Christmas present. I mean, I knew what that meant. That meant because that was going to be the first combat unit of the F-15. So I was now transitioning to the F-15, and boy, was I thrilled. Another traumatic events was an ejection out of a T-38 that happened at Langley. And basically I was on board as an observer to the aggressors. And because the air-to-air performance of the US Air Force was so poor in Vietnam, there was a huge focus on reestablishing air superiority capability. And the aggressors, which were started out as heavy-duty T-38s, re-wing T-38s, and then it went to F-5s, and now they're F-16s and F-15s, and even some F-35s. But at any rate, I jumped in the backseat and said, okay, I need to see how these guys are doing it. And so we're fighting two F-15s out in the middle of the Atlantic, and that ended up being about a 32-minute sortie. And I spent 8 hours commanding my own rubber raft out in the middle of the Atlantic. Also can give you some pause for thought if you're not so cold and trying to do a number of other things. And anyway, that's an hour story right there. I usually call that the 6 beer story, but it's probably a little early for that. So maybe another time. This was also the first time as part of a PCS, a permanent change of station. I actually PCS'd from Langley to Bitburg by flying an F-15. So that's when you have to change, when you have to move, if you will. And by the time in the Air Force in this chart, I moved 20 times in 25 years. But that one was actually via an F-15. On to Bitburg, which was just great. So that was a great place to tour Europe. There's 100 stories there. Became a across the board IP, lots of time, lots of exposure to all kinds of things that were way different than Southeast Asia, way different than the US. And even then there was one sport, we even had base teams there, football, basketball, baseball. So several of us pilots are actually played on the baseball team, and we won the USAFE championship, the European championship for baseball in the US that year. Also, somehow I found time to pick up my master's degree remotely, so to speak, as they would say today. They actually shipped the instructors over to Germany. And that was really exciting. Back to Luke, where I was now in full-fledged IP in the formal RTU, Reserve Training Unit. Actually, just by getting there, I went through the Fighter Weapons and Instructor course. So this is just going through the course to become a weapons officer. But what else, again, lots of stories, but I'll share 4 military sales. Is we had in quick succession Israelis, Japanese, and Saudi pilots come through Luke for training. And that was an interesting exposure to 3 dramatically different cultures and how they took on training of pretty complex high-end machine. So that really, I thought, served as an example of where we go. In that time frame, we also, as one of the 8 guys, we took the first F-15s to Saudi Arabia, to Dhahran, there in end of 1980, I think. After Luke, I actually now went to be got my PhD in fighter pilotology by going to the weapons school. And then luckily I got asked back to be an instructor there and really found out how to focus on the air superiority mission. These were any number of experts that could combine the things that they'd learned tactically, operationally, and then contribute to the development overall where the Air Force was going with respect to the air superiority mission. So it was just a huge opportunity. And across this landscape, what I'll tell you is clearly, I have nothing to do with anything about being a hero, but I will tell you, I know some. I really know some amazing people that could do things that you just can't hardly believe. While I was there, it's kind of this mix of my interest in technology and strategy, et cetera. So I ended up writing 3 weapons school instructional texts, which are all still there today. They've obviously been modified, but radar was a 400-page instructional text on how radars work, how particularly the F-15 radar worked at the time, how to use it, how to employ it. Same with computed weapons delivery, which was air to ground, and then low altitude operations kind of thought process. One of the stories that I want to tell you in terms of, if you want to be John Boyd, you see EM as energy maneuverability. He quantified how you compare multiple aircraft, how they fight against each other, what their turn rates are, what their turn radius are, sustained and instantaneous, how they would compare to each other, which really fit well with my understanding of applying engineering and technology to that. But while I was flying the F4D in Thailand, I was not that I was totally struggling, but I was not a very good bomber. You know, we didn't have any of the electronic stuff that's on the 15, 16 and all the rest of the fighters today, where you just put a dot down there, constantly displayed impact point, drop the bomb, and that's where it hits. You know, this was all, you know, you had to be on the right dive angle, on the right speed, and drop it at the right altitude, know what the winds were. And there were some handy little things to do, something called combat offset, to try and figure out how you adjust for all that stuff. And the idea that where the bomb's going, if you're steep, fast press, means the bomb's going long. And on the other hand, if you're shallow, slow, or early, then the bomb's going short, kind of thought process. And so I tried to work all that, and I still didn't win any quarters at the range and the competition and at the controlled range. And so I talked to Al Cass, a two-tour captain, and he took everybody's money every time at the range, bomber extraordinaire. I said, Al, can you share with me some of your techniques, how you're thinking about this, how you're getting the right bombs off the airplane, and how are you so accurate? And he goes, oh, sure. I go, well, would you use double combat offset, XYZ? How do you do it? And he goes, well, I just kind of look out the window and I say to myself, if I was a bomb, I'd get off the airplane here. Quite helpful, Al. You know, for an engineered technology guy, that's really good. But if you go back to that triangle I showed you up front, it's kind of big picture. Looking out the window becomes an important thing. So now I'm off to the Pentagon, and I mentioned SAF AQL. This is my first tour there, and got involved in, before anybody knew anything about them, B-2, F-117 we were doing at the time. The A-12, and you see a picture of the A-12 in the upper right-hand corner, because this was a nightmare. I was the Air Force guy assigned to make sure the Navy had all of the classified information that the Air Force had developed that could be applied to the A-12. And I thought I did a really good job, and I did a great job of documenting it, because I was flabbergasted at how far off the contractor was and the Navy controlling what they were doing. You know, so I got an opportunity to, you know, at my rank and where I was, the best thing I could do was, they're not listening to me. They're not listening. They're not taking advantage of all this work that the Air Force has done, that they're just embarking on. And captured it. Well, anyway, Bill Gates ultimately canceled the program about a month after I left the Pentagon. And I can tell you a whole bunch of interesting stories about legacy Lockheed guys, which are one of the contractors, and what they were thinking about that. And they didn't have a clue. They didn't understand how far off the mark they were and how far behind they were at the time, kind of thought process. The IC engagement reflects one of the things that AQL had the opportunity to do, is lots of engagement with the intelligence community. So I was introduced to a lot of three letters, a lot of key people that moved up in those organizations, but it was quite illuminating in terms of how their intel or threat data, if you will, then applied to where we were going in terms of the things we were developing. The 9th Fighter Squadron was a command opportunity at Holloman. Wow. Again, it was a squadron that, in fact, it still has the most air-to-air kills in the Air Force ever. They were deployed to the Pacific in World War II, primarily flying P-38s. Dick Bong and Tommy McGuire both cycled through the ninth. So the two of the highest scoring aces ever in the US both went through the ninth squadron, with Dick Bong being a ninth guy forever kind of thought process. This was a time where the Air Force, the commander, also commanded maintenance. So instead of being a commander of about 50 fighter pilots and life support and other administrators in a squadron, now you had probably another 300 maintainers and different skill sets, different organization, different thought process, but really an opportunity to understand how you bring all those pieces together and have a fully functioning combat fighter squadron. And that's what we did. We deployed to Desert Storm, flew initially 11 hours to Spain out of Holloman. Of course, you have to, everything about aviation requires you to get up at dark 30. In this case, I think we left at 1 o'clock in the morning going over. And it reminds me of one of the stories. It didn't happen on this flight, but we were out in the middle of the Atlantic. We did have, this is an 8 ship, tied together. It's dark. We're in the middle of deep, dark clouds. And the story goes that Blue 1's leading the flight, same situation. 3 goes, Blue 1, 3, go ahead, 3. 3, 4's hitting my wingtip. Roger that, 3. Blue 1 to 4, go ahead. 4, quit hitting 3's wingtip. But this, when you think about trust and teamwork, when you're flying at 500 knots and out over the middle of the Atlantic, you can barely see the aircraft that's flying next to you, and you're relying on them to maintain 3 feet right on that wing, not get lost, not hit you, et cetera, et cetera. You can get a sense of where that teamwork thinking comes from. Another story of how to deal with the chain of command is the Royal Saudi Air Force. It turned out when I got there, and actually since we trained the initial cadre of F-15 pilots in the Royal Saudi Air Force, they were all in positions of authority when we got there for Desert Storm. So the base commander was one of my students. The 13th Squadron commander, which was the Saudi F-15s, was a student of mine, as well as the sector commander, Prince Saudi bin Bandar. He was also there. So I had to, and they all came to me because we had all established relationships on issues and things that they should have been going to the Air Force commander, who at that time was a 1-star guy by the name of Gene Santarelli, who luckily for me was a guy that was in my squadron at Bitburg, and we were great friends, had stayed, together. And so I initially elected to say, not totally turn the Saudis off, but go tell Gene and say, hey, they're coming to me for stuff they should be talking to you about. I know it's this, they're comfortable with it. They've got a relationship with me. What do you want me to do? And he said, okay, I'll take that one. And you just, continue to do that. And that'll probably go smoother than me trying to say, no, you got to talk to me and that kind of thing. So how do you think, how do you evolve? How do you change even things as structured as chain of command to make it work better? Coming back, going out of the ninth, coming back from Desert Storm, I just want to mention, I don't have that picture, I should have put it in here. The flying over Kuwait, when Saddam blew up all the oil wells and they were all on fire, was just a vision of destruction that was totally uncalled for. I mean, we flew, the roiling black smoke, and unfortunately, I flew almost always at night. I was on the night shift over there. Our squadron was on the night shift, and I hate flying at night because you can't see anything. But you could certainly see all of Kuwait with this, what was like this giant birthday cake full of candles with the smoke roiling off. It was almost a scene of despondency. Just to share with you, one of my young pilots decided, look at all that black smoke. This will be neat to fly through. Well, yeah, guess what the temperature of all that black smoke and soot is, and he comes back and he's peeled all the paint off an F-15. So my boss wasn't very happy about that I had somebody who was that innovative. Anyway, back to, I end up being some of you may recognize it as the DAO. I worked for the ambassador in Qatar, which is a whole new experience for me. Now's my exposure to the State Department across the board and a number of other letters you'll see down here. Just because it was a small operation, we were in fact building this, what at that time was the secret air base, was Al Udeid. That was one of my major issues there, as well as pre-positioning Army equipment in Qatar. So Al Udeid, as you know, is CENTCOM central base now in the Middle East and been there for some time. But at that time, we were building it. I was on the ambassador's team. State Department guys did not, and military were like oil and water. And it also turned out rank-wise, in equivalent rank, I actually outranked the ambassador's deputy, who was the charge, because it was a smaller embassy. So even though I didn't play to that, and obviously I had no actual command authority in the State Department, they ensured that. The State Department was very sensitive to that. So that was an interesting experience. But I'll relate a story to see both RNA here is the Royal Naval Association. So I'll let you just, I'm sure you'll be impressed that I'm an honorary member of the Royal Naval Association, because most of the expats in Qatar at the time, and still are, were Brit. And so there were significant expats there that were retired from the Royal Navy, and they made me a member of their organization. And so I had to give the Trafalgar speech every year on Trafalgar Day. So that means you gotta, I didn't want to screw that up. So I had to do a lot of library work. So I spent some significant time. This was a little bit before the massive internet. So I'm down in the library in Qatar, in Doha, researching Trafalgar, so I get it right. And luckily there were a lot of English books, but there are still some challenges with the Arabic and the place and XYZ. So anyway, why it was important is both ambassadors, the Brit and the US ambassador, hosted this. And so it had to be done right. Now the other story is HHH. So are there any hashers out there in the audience? You can just jump in on the feed there and say, and note that you are a hash house Harrier. So I became a hash house Harrier, which was a very international operation there. Just lots of fun. Now, those of you that are not familiar with it, some describe it as a running club that drinks or a drinking club that runs, depending on precisely where you are. But anyway, it was interesting that the expats really ran the country, all the infrastructure. So they were the bankers, they were the car dealers, they were the power plant operators. And actually the guy that ran Amiri Flight was a Brit. Amiri Flight was the Emir's aircraft. And he was one of the key guys. So I had all this access to what was going on in the country. And I'd go to the ambassador's staff meetings and he'd go, the Emir's gone. We need to keep track of the Emir. Where'd he go? What time to go? When's he coming back? And they went around the table and all the State Department guys threw their hands up and said, we're going to, we got to do this. We got to do this. We got to call somebody. And he got around to me and I just couldn't help it. So I go, yeah, well, he took off at X time on Monday. He's in Egypt. He's doing this. They're going to come back or on this airplane. You need the tail number or anything? Or, and then, and all the State Department guys' eyes go like this, kind of thing. But it's just how you get a bigger picture in the community. And I just happened to stumble into that. Anyway. And then back to the Pentagon. Unfortunately, I actually had an assignment to be the ops group commander at Nellis, which is, if you had asked me, that's where I really wanted to be. But somehow Joe Ralston decided that my experience at AQL the first time, now I need to go back and direct it. So back to this classified portfolio management and the opportunities to engage with the rest of the acquisition community, including the Congress It was just very interesting here. But just for those of you that don't know, AQL at that time had really the programs technology in air, space, and test in a significantly large budget to accomplish those. And so it was a very interesting place to have the big picture to see how the resource allocation within the Air Force, particularly how much to space, how much to, classic Air Force, how much to the test community. And when you read test community, AQL is primarily funds and monitors and supervises, let's say, the Western.
We're going to let him finish this slide.
Operation. Okay, so
Mike, hey, it's AJ. That was an incredible ride. I think we're going to do a part 2.
got it. Okay,
Are you up for a part 2?
sure.
Yeah, we actually have a million questions also.
We do.
And so I know it's the top of the hour, but my goodness, I think on behalf of our entire audience and the nation, if I may say, we are so happy you didn't become a lawyer.
Yeah, for sure. Gotta say. or a mechanic.
Or a mechanic. Yeah. So we're going to schedule a part 2. Are you available next week?
Should be. It's
All right.
one of the availability levels of retirement that is more flexible.
I didn't hear about you golfing, so I think we're good.
Yep.
Oh no, we haven't gotten to that yet.
Oh, okay. Well, then we're gonna hear about your handicap next week.
There you go.
Now the short story is, while I have played golf with many people that do, my primary task there is to provide entertainment for those that play golf.
Well, I think Jacques and I can probably learn from you on that one.
Yeah, for sure. My golf is very entertaining.
Well, it's such a rich, incredible career experience. We're so pleased to have you on,
Yep.
and we're going to be extra pleased to have you on next week as well. Wow, we all want to hear about the rest of what you want to tell us about your career. It is just incredibly fascinating,
It is.
and I know I am personally learning a lot from a lot that you have to offer. So
Agreed.
thank you so much for being on this week, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah.